Hello, and welcome to the second of 6 videos sharing the findings from my project on the implementation of and compliance with CITES. I'm Professor Tanya Wyatt. I am a professor of criminology at Northumbria University, and I'm posting these videos in honor of World Wildlife Day about sustaining all life. This second video is specifically about the second phase of this research project, which is a Delphi Iterative Survey. So first I'll explain what that kind of survey is, and then explore in more detail each of the findings from round 1 of the survey and then round 2 of the survey. So what is a Delphi Iterative Survey? This is a very intensive, detailed survey, which makes it rather lengthy. So it probably took people between 30 minutes and an hour to complete, as it has numerous questions and asks for a fair amount of detail. The reason why it's iterative is once you do the first round, you then analyze those results and develop new questions based upon the answers of your participants. You then develop those new questions and send out a second survey, which is considered the second round. In some instances, you can carry on for even further rounds, but I chose to actually just keep mine at 2, as people were beginning to repeat themselves and there weren't any new kinds of information that were actually emerging from people's answers in the different 2 rounds. I chose this method in particular because CITES is a very complicated instrument, and I felt that experts were who really would have an insight into how it could be improved and who was actually engaging in best practice and who had lessons learned in the way that they have been implementing and complying with CITES. And so I specifically targeted all of the CITES management and scientific authorities and experts from around the world that could really delve in deep, and conducted it anonymously and confidentially, so I don't know who was answered. I do have information about gender, occupation, as well as if they're governmental or civil society or academic members of the community. Other than that, I don't know who actually did complete the survey, and I think that anonymity allowed people to be quite honest, which I think is evident in the findings that you'll see some in this video, and then certainly in the later videos of the case studies about Canada, Indonesia, and South Africa. I've divided up sharing the findings of the Delphi Iterative Survey in that first round based upon those 4 components of the National Legislation Project. So the first set of findings is about the authorities. And it's interesting to me about the lack of an enforcement authority. As you might already know or remember from video 1, that CITES only requires a scientific authority and a management authority. Over 80 member countries, though, have already implemented an enforcement authority, or already created an enforcement authority as well. And so I was curious, the experts out there, should everyone actually have an enforcement authority, since CITES is so complicated and has this element of illegality running through it? Should actually an enforcement authority be something that we should be moving towards? Most of the participants agreed with that. You can see strongly agreed with 17, agreed with 10. Something interesting I wanted to explore as well is, should that enforcement authority be separate from the other authorities? This idea of, is there some sort of conflict of interest if the 3 authorities are actually situated within the same organization? Again, most people agreed, 13 strongly agreed at 8. So there is a bit of a consensus around the separation between the enforcement authority and other authorities gives them that needed independence. I've drawn quotes out that I think were quite interesting in relation to the authorities. unpacking further this idea around separation. And one participant saying it isn't really about the separation, but mostly about their independence, and that they aren't pressured from the other organization, the other authority, other agencies. That's really the most critical element. One participant suggested about co-locating, so a physical shared space that makes it quite efficient to work together, to get to know each other, and to collaborate. Another participant argued that the scientific authority is actually the most critical, yet so much of the focus that we talk about is on enforcement. And then again, the management authority applies the rules is also a critical element. This idea that the science that should be underpinning CITES really should be the focus of what we're talking about. An interesting analogy in the fourth quote, this idea of a three-legged stool, that the MASA and EA are each one of the legs, just as important as the other, and they all need to be there for it to work properly. And that gives a visualization about the independence that they actually need, and that you need each leg, but it has a different perspective and a different role to play. I think that's a rather good visual for how we could be picturing the scientific management and enforcement authorities. Moving on to the second component around prohibition. I developed 5 possible ways that maybe prohibition could be better implemented within CITES. Introduce of trade suspensions, which already exists within the CITES provisions, that if a member country is not actually complying with implementation, that there is the possibility to enact trade suspensions. Most participants agreed, 11 strongly, 13 agree that this is a tactic that should be used. And as we see in later videos, participants actually arguing that CITES should be using these provisions more often, since they are actually a possibility. It is not currently within CITES about introducing quotas, but I thought the idea, rather than being a complete kind of trade suspension, but to just reduce a country's ability to participate in trade, might also be a bit of a stick to actually comply and implement CITES. Obviously, that would take resolutions or decisions, but the idea was to offer another way forward rather than full suspensions. So I asked about introducing reduced quotas. Some agreement there, but not strongly in either way. I also recommended creating a task force or some sort of working group to assist countries. That was very well supported. 14 strongly agree, 16 agree. Other ideas that I proposed about more visibility on CITES' website. The resolutions and decisions are there. What about actually giving visibility to how countries are doing in terms of implementation and compliance? Why not make it more public, more visible about the levels of engagement? Some strong agreement there, and agreement as well. And then finally, I suggested maybe a system of mentorships, a supportive kind of element to add to CITES, where countries would help each other to actually work through legislation, improve legislation, or even improve reporting, say, or other components of the national legislation project. Again, this was fairly well thought of, 10 strongly agreeing and 20 agreeing that some system of country mentorships might actually help for those countries who haven't quite got to the complete level of implementation that would be beneficial. Other quotes around prohibition. Some countries may prohibit imports, or you can see in the first one, requiring more of the holder of the specimen to prove legality. And this comes up a number of times throughout the Delphi Iterative Survey, and then in the interviews or the case studies that you'll hear later about having the importer actually take a much more active role in setting a standard for what kind of evidence should be available for a country that is exporting CITES. Internal education programs were recommended for policymakers in conjunction with general public awareness campaigns. There's the idea that there's a lot of places where people may simply just not be aware of what is needed to comply with the national legislation. And then the third bullet point on this slide that I returned to a few times as well, stricter domestic measures are a good mechanism for preventing trade. And we see that in a number of the case studies that the governance over nationally protected species that are also under the CITES listings is more than required of the convention, and maybe this contributes to some best practice. The third component of the national legislation project around penalization, and you'll see that it's the same 5 questions that I asked around prohibition, but applying it to getting countries to actually implement measures that meet this particular component. Again, trade suspensions could be used. There's some support for that, but a lot of neither agree nor disagree, and a bit of disagreeing on that proposal. It's introduction of the reduced quotas, which again is my idea of something, an alternative way of gaining more implementation and compliance rather than suspensions. Again, about the same, not particularly supportive of that. But the other 3, maybe a bit more supportive of these ideas of creating task forces or working groups to actually help countries adjust their penal codes to better implement CITES, having more visibilities on the CITES website and in the media as well about countries, how they're doing or not doing in terms of properly penalizing the trade in violations of the convention, and then a system of country mentorships. And maybe this can be in conjunction with the mentorship around prohibition, but again, this was fairly well supported by the participants in the first round. Quotes around penalization. Interesting that one person said, much of this problem extends well beyond CITES itself. And for those familiar with research around wildlife trafficking, will know that corruption is really one of the areas that needs to be tackled with some matter of urgency. So this systematic issue around corruption facilitating wildlife trafficking. So it's hard to actually properly penalize illegal trade in a country that may have systemic corruption. Also related to poor governance, and unless these issues are addressed, this participant's arguing that there will be no progress on CITES enforcement, which is a point well taken. Penalization around what about moving into other realms, other toolkits as it sometimes gets referred to, about forfeiture of assets. So not just relying on fines and imprisonment, but actually expanding what we think of in terms of penalties. Again, the point around importing countries that I mentioned on the last slide, coming up again, what action can importing countries actually take against exporters who are clearly not implementing the convention properly by possibly not providing evidence around non-detriment findings? That kind of level of scrutiny, could penalties come from that possibly? Thinking about civil penalties rather than just criminal, so not just relying on imprisonment or criminal fines, but other kinds of approaches. And then a point that I made in the first presentation, in the first video that's available, that it's difficult to actually find the penalties related to CITES because they're not necessarily located within the wildlife trade legislation. They very well might be in other sections of the penal code. So hard to know what they are, and then hard to know are the penalties sufficient as a deterrent, as the participant in bullet point 4 talks about, or do people who are illegally trading just take fines, maybe a bit of prison time, as the cost of doing business, and factor this into how much they're charging or how much they're illegally trading. The fourth component is around confiscations. Again, you see the same 5 questions, but applying to confiscations. Again, trade suspensions are a possibility, somewhat supported. Reducing quotas, not so much. In fact, they that this was neither disagree or agree, but also a fair amount of people disagreeing with this idea. But a task force or working group was supported. More visibility, though some disagreement there. There's some sensitivity to actually posting when countries maybe aren't managing to meet their obligations. And then the final one is establishing a global or regional network of zoos. And participants pointed out that to some degree this already exists. So it wouldn't be an entirely new product to actually create an entirely new network. Many countries already have really good relationships with zoos, aquariums, sanctuaries, gardens in their countries to actually take confiscated wildlife, in particular live wildlife. The confiscations also brought up the idea around widening what can be a penalty, and in particular suggestions, and good ones I would think, around building in cost recovery mechanisms into country legislation. Part of the problem, particularly with live wildlife, but also even if you're having to store products and derivatives of wildlife, is the costs that are incurred to have to do that. So can a cost recovery mechanism actually be built in to alleviate that kind of pressure and make it more realistic that member countries can actually do these confiscations, because the criminal proceeds or proceeds from violations would be helping to actually pay for that. Interesting that the confiscation matter, according to the participant in the second bullet point, is a very temporal and local concern, and that maybe people on the outside looking in think that a lot of live wildlife is actually confiscated, when actually that's probably more of the smaller numbers, and most of what would be confiscated is actually consumables, products, or derivatives. But in either case, great points made here by the participants about the prohibition of reselling that, so that you're not somehow inadvertently perpetuating the illegal trade by just confiscating illegal wildlife and then furthering it on into the market, just in a different context. A participant suggested that the member states could actually report on their confiscations in their biannual report, and that this could be publicized on the CITES website. And then the fourth point is a huge capacity gap among many parties, even in developed nations, which may have procedures in place, struggle with finding appropriate care facilities or expertise. And this refers somewhat back to the funding issues around it being cost prohibitive to actually keep live wildlife for feeding and housing, but also to store any sorts of evidence or confiscated products and derivatives. Moving on to compliance, so not the 4 components of the National Legislation Project, but actual compliance of member countries with the convention. Similar kinds of suggestions that I had about trade suspensions for not complying, which was disagreed with. The reduction of quotas, also disagreed with. Creating a task force was supported to some degree to assist countries with actually becoming more compliant. And this is particularly around annual and biennial reports. More visibility on the CITES website in the media about this. This was mostly agreed with as well. And then drawing on some practice from other multinational environmental agreements like water conventions, where they actually have dedicated sessions, their meetings to complete their reports. So I suggested having a dedicated session at the standing committee or having a dedicated session at the conference of the parties, where there's just an allotted time where representatives from every member country come and actually do the reports then and there, which would ensure that every standing committee meeting, which would be annually or even more than that in some years, or every 3 years, you have completion of the reports so that everyone would be ensured that these would be completed. And there's some support for that, but mostly it's not clear either way for those two suggestions. The first bullet point they're talking about actually in general, member countries of CITES actually do report, and this is in part because of the compliance mechanism that is around. You can have trade suspension if you don't complete the reporting for your member country. Interesting that this participant brought up the idea isn't just about reporting and making deadlines, but about the quality of the reporting, and that much more focus needed to be given to this, about ensuring that the report is detailed and complete, rather than just checking boxes and being done. Excluding non-compliant parties from participation in some activities until they've completed the reports, that's an interesting idea. So maybe you can't attend one of the committee meetings or the conference of the parties or other types of activities until the reports have actually been submitted. Have a full report on non-compliance. This participant indicated this used to be a practice that CITES undertook. Use of Article 13 by the Secretariat has been good, but too limited. And the overall idea, countries are too nice to each other, that maybe we should be posting on websites about compliance or non-compliance, reporting or not reporting, turning to trade suspensions, possibly a bit more often to get countries to implement and comply with CITES. In contrast to that, though, a different participant talked about punitive measures are actually not appropriate for completion of reports, and that there needed to be a more supportive environment to actually get countries on board to do these. Partly because there's difficulty in completing the reports, and so why not to provide assistance rather than trying to be more punitive? And I think there's more to unpack there in the future about what would be the best tactic to actually take in regards to compliance for reporting in particular. Based upon that, then, I drafted a few different questions, again, around the 4 components in compliance, and sent it out again. And as you can see, have less participants in the second round, and not all of them are the same participants. So some people completed the second round who did not complete the first round. And so in regard with authorities, I asked, independence is more important than separation, and a majority of the second round participants agreed with that. I also asked around defining roles and responsibilities, and that was strongly agreed with, that this needs to be, this is a critical kind of element of CITES, and making sure it's very clear what the scientific authority does, what the management authority does, and what the enforcement authority does if there is one. Authorities should be separate, should be co-located. Some people agree with this, but there's also those that neither disagree or agree, and also disagreed. But it really is about defining roles and having independence. And the quote at the bottom of the screen is interesting. Good examples around the world. Key to success for enforcement is this independent decision making, particularly for risk management. need to have good communication with the management authority, regardless if this is embedded within the same organization or if it's actually an outside agency, and a values-based understanding of trade and application of the law. Moving on to the second component around prohibition. Based upon the answers from the first round, I developed these questions. It came up again many times in the survey participant answers, and you'll see it again or hear it again in the videos about the case studies. This issue that countries actually only prohibit or enforce CITES for native species, so only those species that are actually CITES listed that occur or are inhabitants of that member country. Participants actually disagreed with that in terms of prohibiting, and then even more strongly disagreed with that in terms of enforcement. And I think that's something to explore a bit further. As I mentioned, it comes up again around stricter domestic measures as being good mechanisms for preventing trade in wild taken specimens. And as I said before, this comes up again in the interviews around the case studies about having internal, national, domestic kinds of regulations that actually are more strict than what CITES requires, but maybe this has some sort of protective mechanism. In contrast to that, though, one participant says, and you can see the quote at the bottom of the screen, that stricter domestic measures undermine the spirit of the convention, and some measures senseless and unscientific. It's really kind of getting at the idea that there are practices within CITES that are more emotional than scientific. So stricter domestic measures, if allowed to continue, will result in parties not participating in CITES. So if countries are putting CITES legislation in that is more stringent, more strict than the convention actually requires, that this will put some countries off and actually keep them from participating any longer. Again, I think it's another area to research in the future. Around penalization, asking about these expanded penalties that were mentioned in the participant answers around asset forfeiture and or confiscation as an underused penalty. People mostly agreed with that, though some disagreement and some strong, one participant strongly disagreeing. And then again, this recurring issue around importing countries could respond more strongly by not allowing countries with poor implementation. And this was agreed with for the most part. One participant pointing out, and I've heard this in other contexts in my research over wildlife trafficking over the years, about wildlife crime as a predicate to others. So having it be possible that you can use other instruments to actually investigate wildlife crime. Could those be financial measures, taxes, banking issues? And a lot of countries don't have the resources or policies to go after the money. And then in regards to importing countries, imports for countries with poor implementation are likely only exacerbate the problem of limited resources when countries also have legal trade. That's an interesting idea that if you are somehow disallowing what is legal because you're requiring a certain amount of evidence, or you're turning it away because there isn't proof of a non-detriment finding, for instance, that this increases the burden and makes it more difficult for countries that are already struggling with resources. So again, there's more to be found out about that particular issue. But the role of importing countries actually did come up at the most recent conference of the parties, and one participant suggested that CITES should not be placing countries in Category 1 unless they contain penalties for trade in violation. The intimation there that there are countries who are Category 1 that don't actually have penalties that suit what the convention requires. In terms of confiscations, linked to this idea of asset forfeiture. Should countries, I'm suggesting, implement measures for cost recovery, mostly supported by the participants in the second round. Also around mechanisms for asset forfeiture, also supported. And then asking if participants thought that confiscated wildlife, either alive or products and derivatives, re-entering the trade is an important problem. And there was agreement with that as well. And a participant suggested that the confiscated wildlife can be used for educational purposes, or for evidence, obviously, in cases that are filed, and that the suggestion that storage is actually not a good choice. The participant didn't expand upon that, but I surmise a bit that is around the possibility of reselling and feeding into the illegal wildlife trade, even if it's unintentionally, or just issues around the cost of storing, and then problems with thefts might be part of the issue why storage isn't a good choice. And I'm also asked around how can we actually improve the national legislation project in general? Are these 4 components enough? Could we add other components to actually make the implementation compliance with CITES even better? And 2 that I picked out for this presentation are around adding a metric around number of successful prosecutions, which came up a number of times in the participants. It doesn't matter, how well we've implemented or complied. What if we actually aren't enforcing and carrying that through to the final stages? Some agreement with that, 3 strongly, 11 agree that it would be an interesting or maybe a helpful metric to add to the national legislation project. And the other suggestion is to add a metric to the NLP about the penalties that are allowed. So not just that there are penalties, but actually being prescriptive about what those penalties should be. That's sort of getting at the idea. The suggestion has been that CITES should be brought in line with the UN Transnational Organized Crime Protocol, where serious crime is given 4 years of prison sentence. And maybe that's one way to go, but this is much more of just a generic question around should those penalties be prescribed by CITES, and there was a fair amount of agreement for that. That then is the findings, some of the findings. There are many more things I found that will be available on my website from the entirety of the survey and the executive summaries and reports and articles that I'll be writing from this project. But the next video will be about Canada, which is the first case study country.